this computer.
No.
So here we go. Everybody hears me. So hello, good morning, everybody. I hope everybody's doing good. I'm happy to see all of you guys. So welcome to the Media Club. Today we're gonna talk about the book called Henry Jenkins, Convergence Culture, where old and new media collide. And we have today a host, it's Frank Romanelli. Frank, you're also like in Providence, right?
I am in Newport right now.
Newport?
Yeah. I see Renee and I are bookends here. I'm looking at my screen. Between the thousands of miles between us, we're about 2 miles apart.
So we're going to talk about today's convergence culture. And so we're going to have like some experts. I'm looking forward to discussion. Maybe, Frank, do you want to say a word first about the book, how you first came across that book, or maybe...
Well, yeah, the title got my attention right away because throughout my career as an educator and as just a lover of digital literacy, I have always been fascinated with the idea of where the old meets the new. So when I came upon Jenkins, I said, he gets me. I got excited. So I started reading his stuff, and now in 2020, I'm more fascinated to look back on where he was in 2006.
Mm-hmm.
You know, a year and a half before the iPhone came out, and kind of the prophecies that he was making, and where we are now with all of that, and that drives the conversation for me. So I really, it's been a fun book for me.
Yeah. When did you read it the first time? Do you remember? Like
the first time I read it, I was probably 2011, 2012.
Okay.
And already then I was fascinated by how far we had gone, and we hadn't even, barely broke the crust yet in terms of how far we've gone since.
Yeah,
so,
very, very true.
One thing that fascinates me is, and this is true to me so much in the topics of digital media literacy, is how much things stay true and new. He talks about that, how media never really goes away. But to me, also that, I'm always amazed that a book like this can read like it was just written in a lot of ways. And kind of what the social statement around that is and what the educational implications of that are. So that's kind of the stuff that I was thinking about for today too.
Very, very good. Maybe like to start, maybe we could do hold on, I'm going to have somebody else coming along. Maybe could do like a round table, getting like first impressions on the book. Maybe if somebody wants to speak to the book, if they enjoyed reading the book, if they had some surprises. So I'm not sure if somebody wants to first go ahead with that. For me personally, I was, for example, when I read it, I really had to. It was kind of funny. There was a couple of things. The first thing was that I learned about Survivor and the American Idol. I had no clue about that. So in a way, it was like a very American discussion right here to see for me. And I'm not, so I was not familiar with that. So that's one thing. And the other thing that I really enjoyed right away, and it really hit me, and that was the question of the knowledge community at the beginning. And I wanted maybe to come back to that because that's something I'm very interested in. So these are two aspects that hit me like right away from the beginning. And I had to look actually also when the book was written, because I thought, like you were saying, Frank, for me it was very interesting maybe to do that comparison between 2007 and 2020. So
yep.
Maybe anybody else wants to speak to that?
Okay, Davina?
Yeah. So for me, it was Jenkins. For me, has always been very prescient. He's tended to look at things and write about them. Maybe because in terms of technology adoption, India is a little behind of the US. So maybe given the cultural background that I come from, the socioeconomic background that I come from, Jenkins seems that he's prescient, quite like Castells. But this was something that we were discussing before we actually began the meeting, is how the very things that the new media afford us are being used in today's India to subvert participatory culture. For instance, your Twitter, YouTube, WhatsApp, which would be used to maybe make groups, to gather people together to protest against whether it's some sort of injustice or whether it's against some government policy, being actively used by certain political parties and other corporate organizations to spread misinformation, fake news. For instance, right now, India is in the midst of this huge debate about this act that has been passed, and it's got to do with citizenship, it's got to do with migration and immigrants, and there's this protest that's been happening, a physical protest. It's actually live since the last 2 months almost. And the amount of fake news, the amount of memes, the amount of forwards and messages that you get on groups and videos on YouTube, it is quite intense. And well, some of them are in favor of the protests, and actual participatory, the voice that people have and the agency that they're using to voice against the said act, versus the kind of volume of information that is against this protest. And the kind of, so not just your mainstream media, your news channels. So we have an equivalent of Fox News USA in India as well. And people, I mean, the entire channel is crazy. And yet they are one of the most active agencies which want to spread this kind of fake news. I mean, it's a news channel and it spreads fake news. And the same thing is happening online as well. I think I've spoken too much and digressed a bit. So that's me.
Don't worry, don't worry.
I think it's really worth pointing out that Henry Jenkins understood the positive and beneficial elements that were creating this convergence. When I reread the book, I realized how much he was speaking to the industry as much as he was speaking to anyone. And all of that stuff about transmedia storytelling is really his way of addressing the creative community. And you're right, Davina, he did not anticipate or in any way predict how all this participation would lead to discord. And in fact, I think I've always quibbled with Henry Jenkins since the day this book came out. We still argue about it when we get an opportunity, because the strength of this book is also its like limitation, right? The framing participation and engagement in relation to fans and fandom is how he understands the ideal media consumer, right? The ideal media consumer in his mind is a fan who's also producing fan fiction and other stuff. And I don't think that the fan is the ideal. I don't think the fan is the ideal media creator or consumer at all, right? Because the fans' loyalty and attachments is so profound that they lack—
are always going to be biased
to critically analyze, right? So, but he does make a compelling case for the value of the fan. And I do feel like I think he was successful in persuading me that fandom is a worthwhile part of the way people engage with media.
No, but see, that's the problem in India right now, right? You could call the trolls that have been hired or not by the ruling party. And there was a report actually which came out that versus 100 accounts of the opposition, there are clearly around 18,000 or 20,000 accounts of the ruling party, which use this, you could call it fandom, or you could call it payments, like literal cash or whatever, to use to spread this fake news. So one way of using trolls against people who are genuinely protesting or genuinely trying to be a part of the participatory culture is these trolls, these paid or fan trolls.
Yeah, I think one of the things for me that stood out, because I hadn't reread this book since it came out, I think. But I'm always telling my students to read it when they have an interest in it. But I hadn't gone back and looked at it in a long time, and that idea, I think that's why my students really relate to it, because they can see themselves in what he's talking about, right? If they're fans of something, and it's, on the one hand, it's really flattering, you know, and for me, it connects to the Howard Rheingold's idea of smart mobs, and, you know, all of these really interesting and maybe even progressive ways that people are using media, new media, if we even still use that term. But then I'm reminded, on the other hand, of always like Stuart Hall, you know, when he talked about oppositional reading and how so few people are really engaged. You know, how do you become an oppositional reader? You know, what is the knowledge that you need to make that argument against a media text in some way? And, you know, when Hall would write about the role of the audience member, he always talked about how that was a very small number overall. So, Renee, I tend to agree with you on that one. It's like, on the one hand, yes, we might be doing little parts of what Henry says, and I love it, because I think it flatters the ego a little bit, doesn't it? Yes, I am engaged, I am you know, participating in a way that's progressive. But on the other hand, is that really how we are, most of us, including myself, really consuming media all the time in that very active way? I don't buy that argument ultimately, but it was fun to go back and reread Henry. It was great.
I had to pursue beyond the book to find out where else he went, because, like you said, Renee, the whole book was built largely around entertainment. And I said, well, beyond entertainment, where else? You know, I look at media from an educational perspective. So I did. I just posted a link that I did find him in a discussion in a conference, a New School conference with Liz Losh, that I liked, where he takes it to some of those other places, and I was glad. You know, that's also where he mentions that he's a glass is 3/4 full kind of guy. He actually uses that expression. And yeah, that comes across loud and clear from like what you said, Renee. You know, he even in his predictions of where things were going, he was much more glossy-eyed and positive than the way things have gone.
Yeah, because in 2006 we were still trying to understand remix culture and copyright laws, and how copyright was laws were, how some interpretations of copyright were closing down creative expression. So all of that part of the book was, you know, very much in part of a conversation with Larry Lessig and with other folks who were thinking in new ways. We were all recognizing that a narrow understanding of copyright was interfering with the new kinds of creative expressions that were happening online. What I feel like is more overt reading it now, I'm more aware of now reading that book after all these years have passed, is how much he's speaking to the industry about the creative or the business, the creative or the profit potential of, you know, transmedia properties, of taking one story and blowing it out into video games and apps and, you know, merchandising. And of course, again, all that seems like, yeah, we've been living in that world for a long time, right?
Yep.
But nowhere in that book does he really say that transmedia storytelling can close down creativity, foreshorten creativity, and constrain how people think about storytelling. For his optimism about it, I kept wanting to point out, like, actually there's like a lot of downsides to the Marvel universe, you know?
It's kind of the old book versus movie debate, right? Like, take it out of my imagination and tell me what I'm supposed to hear and see, and you've taken away my ability to create my own picture and sound. And yeah, that's kind of the same theme.
And what makes something go viral today? just if you have a few million shares or a few million comments beneath a particular story, that's enough to make something go viral, right? So there's the creativity there then.
Is that really creative, is what you're wondering? Fred, weigh in on this. We see you there listening. You're looking happy. You're the only one who looks like you're working. Oh no, Michael's working too. Oh, okay, Natasha, you're in your office. What's your take on Henry Jenkins? And introduce yourself to us. Help us understand where you enter into this conversation.
Well, I saw that you guys were having this chat, and I read the book. I will say I read the book like a few years ago, and I didn't have it like with me. I just kind of happened upon the discussion, and was interested because I actually interacted with a bunch of Jenkins people before he left MIT and went out to USC, because I'm in the Boston area, and I'm a high school teacher. So I mean, I kind of find it fascinating. I think one of the things that you said that is really on the mark is, I was just writing actually in the chat that like one of the first really robust versions of this sort of transmedia thinking that I can really remember was the Matrix franchise, and how they really tried to push the boundaries of what was available at that moment. And that's like 1999. And so in 2006, we still were very much in the sort of Pollyanna, everything's awesome kind of like thoughts about technology and what you can do with it. And some of the things though, I mean, I do think still have like real potency, you know, in that sense of, I mean, I think fandom was his window in, but this notion of like trying to get young people to participate in the making of like legitimate, you know, intellectual property, for lack of a better way to say it, and to use like the works of these great, I mean, we all stand on shoulders of giants, right? So to use these other media sort of products as platforms for your own thing, I mean, I do think that there's real power in that. We probably don't do that enough actually in education, to give them a real sense of authority, like students a real sense of authority or power. Instead, we kind of, I don't know, at least at the high school level, I just got through having a class where I was saying, I don't want robots, you know, like when you're writing, I don't want robots, because, you know, eventually you're going to just be replaced by a robot. So let's do something that's better than that.
Right.
And these kinds of ways are ways in for, you know, young people, because it's building on something that they already know and have familiarity with. And so that they can feel like they have more authority, as opposed to asking them to read some like, you know, 19th century novel and pretend like they have authority.
Yeah, sure. Because you ask the kids to write about Harry Potter or the Matrix, and they can write for pages and pages, right? They can have strong opinions because they have the funds of knowledge here to actually contribute to a dialogue. And why the hell we're afraid of that in schools, it continues to flummox me.
I'm with you.
Yeah, I realized when he mentioned the comment about about Moby Dick, and I said, "Oh man, that's still a problem. I'm dealing with that right now. Tomorrow's the final day for registration in the high schools for me in my concurrent enrollment program, and I have high schools who have blocked everything so they can't get on eCampus to register. You know, and it's just, here we are, 2020. I'm like, still really, you know, and also my 7th year into this program's really by now you haven't whitelisted us. Like, come on, you know."
Well, I don't remember if this was referenced in the book or not. I just know from the like living in this area at the time that a lot of that Moby Dick choice was driven by the fact that he had grad students embedded in New Bedford, Massachusetts, where like obviously Moby Dick has a significant like contribution to the cultural life there. And so every kid reads it, but like, does every kid read Moby Dick everywhere else? No. And I don't think that's what he was saying. I mean, he was sort of talking about how you can manipulate and work with something like that. But yeah, I mean, if you've been to New Bedford, it's pretty clear Moby Dick's a big deal.
Right.
Yeah, that's why I think the idea of Henry's work with Remix still resonates with students so powerfully. And I think, I don't know, I don't remember the original when I read it the first time, but rereading it, I was struck by how many of the criticisms he at least addressed are acknowledged, maybe not fully addressed, but certainly acknowledged in the opening chapter, in the introductory chapter. You know, he talked a lot about, you know, a privilege, whether he's talking about class or, you know, economic strata or whatever. And I thought that I didn't quite remember that from the first time, but maybe that was just a lapse on my part. But I think he did acknowledge that there are some limitations, and there, you know, he was acknowledging at least some of the criticisms of his piece, which, you know, I mean, that's all you can ask for, really, I think, you know.
No, my issue with the work is that you pinpoint a few cases which are like a 1 in a million or a 1 in a billion case. And you sort of highlight the emancipatory nature of participatory culture. It kind of becomes like this utopic device, media device or media content that you can generate, and just like that, all problems will be solved. I don't know, it tends to give me that impression.
Yeah. So was it a form of propaganda, this book, as a way to kind of sell an idea by positioning this set of practices as the ideal practice? Or no, you couldn't call it propaganda.
I'm not sure if I would call it. I'm not sure if I would call it propaganda, you see, but I think he's, like he was saying, he was very positive about the whole thing. And it reminded me, I think somewhere he's saying that also when he's comparing that to the radio theory, and the radio came up like in the 20s, and everybody hoped that it's going to be interactive and going to have suddenly like all these. So that kind of experience, like with the radio theory, that did not go all the way, then comes back to me like right here with the internet in a way. So it's, so I hope, of course, it would be nice, and there's lots of potential, but didn't fly with the radio. It didn't fly with the internet so far.
Yes,
maybe
exactly.
One day,
so tech is tech. I mean, how you use it, it depends on the people who use it, right? There's no point in calling a technology emancipatory or something that's going to bring about a revolution. For instance, there were a lot of papers that I read about Twitter and Arab Spring, and sort of this, I mean, they did not spell causality right out there, but there was this crazy hopefulness that Twitter is the home ground for the Arab Spring. Yeah. When actually that was just one of the reasons why the Arab Spring took place. It was not the major reason. There were a lot of other things that were happening. There was a lot of other oppression that was being spoken about in public meetings, in universities, and students were, you know, talking about it, quite like what's happening in India right now. And yeah, my problem is that. So I'm sure that he didn't mean to do it intentionally. It was unintentional. But the idea that a certain technology can suddenly make it interactive, can suddenly make it participatory, and can bring about this revolution just by maybe picking up a few cases here and there. Of, like, for instance, in the video that Michael shared, the Harry Potter Alliance, I mean, it's a great alliance. It's bringing about some real change. But how many more Harry Potter alliances are there? I mean, I did not hear about it before the talk.
Yeah, I want to build on that idea because, of course, I think of one of the phrases that for me has kind of become obsolete, a phrase that's used in the book that for me doesn't work anymore, is the phrase collective intelligence, right? So, and I think about like, well, so what term do I use now? And I would say now I think about it as networked learning, right? And I feel like what's the difference between collective intelligence and networked learning is learning is more process oriented, and collective implies that everyone shares a single goal. And I feel like that is definitely not, that's definitely not what robust learning communities are like. They're networked in that they're interacting with each other, but they don't all have kind of a hive mind feeling that word collective suggests.
Well, collective intelligence, like, I think framed today sounds a lot more like some sort of algorithmic oppression, actually.
Yeah. Yeah.
Good
Makes me
point.
think of the board, right?
Right.
Hey, Ralph, will you tell us your story about Convergence Culture and reading it in 2006 and reading it again, or maybe thinking about it again in relation to your life in 2020?
Really, in 2020, this era we're in now. Can you hear me okay, by the way?
Yes.
Okay. I think the environment certainly changed quite a bit. The biggest change being, I think, it's atomized us, because I'd always thought, like, when you were just talking about collective intelligence, that I sort of think about it like the way Infotopia portrayed it, that we're smart because we put our brains together, and not so much a hive mind, but that we're kind of collectively working on the same thing. But a lot of what's happened has atomized us, and kind of made it harder for us to like row in the same direction. So, collective political activities become, I think, much kind of smaller clumps. And so then the media that connects those people together becomes more niche. And I think that's interesting and has both, advantages and disadvantages, which is kind of ambiguous. But, I think inside of a group, you can have better conversations, but you can lose the fact that you're in kind of a bubble at the same time. So,
Yeah. We weren't seeing the bubble. Definitely, we weren't seeing the bubble. We were also positive. I mean, when I first read this book, it was right around Arab Spring, and I was like, the voice of the people. Hey, this is really happening the way he envisioned it, and the way other people I was reading had envisioned it. And of course, I'm one of those people too that thinks everything's great until I realize it's not. So, I just bought in all the way, and I think that's the danger. But yeah, I don't think it was propaganda either. I think he was just one of those positive fools like me.
Yeah, I think there's something about the early adopters of the technologies, because I was really struck by the connection to Rheingold's work as well when I went back and read it, that, they were early adopters of the technology. And I think you see this throughout the history of mass media, don't you? Like the potential is always there, whether it's Hollywood film or, early rock and roll, whatever it is, like when it's wide open and the economic and industry constraints aren't in place yet, the systems aren't in place, like I think it has much more the potential for many more people to participate, I think is greater at those moments. But then when the systems come into place and the economic realities of whatever the new technology is start to emerge, I think then you tend to see these pieces being shut down. And I totally agree, Ralph. It's like the idea now that we have the potential to be connected, and we have the potential to do something collectively politically, but do we do that through the use of technology? I'm not convinced at all.
So my problem there is the way we structure our country, our economies. So I think for all the problems that we have, because we end up commodifying technologies because of capitalism.
Well, he points out that, and this was troubling to me, this realization too, like, okay, some things we move so slowly on, or we don't move at all. And Davina, you were talking about, before we came in, about pretty much how, the digital divide still lives, well in India. And certainly I worked in New Bedford for 2 years, Fred. I know how poor it is there. And I was really troubled by like being reminded of the white middle class college educated person that leads the trail, and that defines Silicon Valley, and that continues to that we've done very little to break through that bubble, and that there's still a digital divide. I mean, just last semester I lost a student in Providence because my course was too digital, and the student couldn't keep up because he didn't have the resources at home. And by the time I realized, that we could have provided him with a resource, he was gone. And I talked to the dean about that at length. And I said, we got to make sure this doesn't happen, but how do we do that?
But the thing that Jenkins, so for me, he's a freak, actually. he's like an online freak who's like spending hours and hours on the computer and trying to be in these online communities. So I'm not identifying myself with this guy or this kind of community. So the whole sociology that should actually, maybe we should look into the audience when we look at the media audience is somehow very important to understand here. And these online communities and collective intelligence that he's evoking when he's talking about survivor at the beginning is, and I don't know, it's just like maybe it happened like in that case and they brought up like the best thing out of the group, but in a way it's also maybe you cannot take for granted that something of value always comes out of a group discussion.
Michael, I am totally with you. I am totally with you on that. And I feel like we do understand that Jenkins was creating or shifting the paradigm, the empowerment protection paradigm in media studies, right, with this book. He was refusing to acknowledge that there could be risks, harms, disadvantages, power inequalities, that reproducing the status quo was going to be an issue. He shoved aside any of the potential downsides of increasingly media saturated society, and he held up this deep engagement as an optimal lifestyle, when many of us on the protectionist side were saying, yeah, no, they're already using media 10 hours a day. You know, by glorifying fandom, you're creating this, you're lionizing this immersiveness that works totally against critical thinking. Because when you're immersed in your fan culture, critical thinking is, I think, compromised.
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, in a way, this is like that is targeted for the audience really like at that far end of the long tail, right? Like, as you know, like that sort of parabolic curve that like the further out you get, the most intense people, there's just fewer of them. You know, I mean, it's because most people don't have time for all that immersion.
Right.
So like, that's a sort of fascinating, I think, insight. And I the other thing I would say, because I'm gonna have to run, is that you, just because like you can do it doesn't necessarily like mean that like really good results are always going to be coming through, you know. When we've seen that sort of like in really stark relief. So more people engaged isn't by itself always a positive.
Yeah. Popularity does not equal quality.
Right. Thank you so much. I'll look forward to the rest of the recording.
We'll hope to see you.
Thanks so much, Fred. Have a nice one.
You too.
Thank you.
Take care, Fred.
See ya.
My issue is also with the fact that why is fandom being exalted to this level? I mean, I'm a Harry Potter fan. I'm a Potterhead, but I only use that time to immerse myself in the book and not think about anything else. It's great that a Harry Potter alliance exists and people have used the metaphor of Dumbledore's army to actually become Dumbledore's army in real life. Although that sounds really old. I mean, the binary between in real life and virtual life. But anyway, I digress. Why can my fandom not just be for enjoyment? Why do I have to necessarily become an activist or become part of the participatory culture?
Yeah, I think that's interesting, the connection between the politics, because when I show my students, or my students have to read a little bit of Henry Jenkins, and then I show them the Harry Potter Alliance, that the class is often split, you know, between how they feel about politics in the real world. And I think that's something that that Jenkins doesn't like fully address, because he does talk about the political implications of fandom within fandoms. If I'm not mistaken, I might be wrong here, it's too long ago, but didn't Jenkins also write that article about Star Trek zines, I think maybe in the 80s, and how it allowed this space for gay men to express you know, their particular identities. I mean, that was pretty early on. And so like that is a political move within a fandom. But I think for me, his later writing wasn't maybe interested in that, didn't delve into that at all, the politics between within the fandom. But then where do you take that? Do you move that, you know, beyond your group or your fandom?
Natasha, you bring up a really important point. I'm sorry, Renee, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, did he write that article? Am I right? Like, am I thinking about the right one?
His first book, right?
Yeah.
His dissertation. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
So, I guess how you feel about convergence culture, transmedia storytelling, fandom, it has something to do with how you understand popular culture and the appropriate stance toward popular culture, right? And so Henry Jenkins embodies the spirit of his intellectual grandfather, John Fiske, right? Whose approach to thinking about popular culture was rooted in celebrating it and honoring it and respecting it. And that stands in stark contrast to the Birmingham school, the Frankfurt school, which was suspicious of and angry toward popular culture. And I think in some ways that dialectic, there's another dialectic where sometimes we celebrate, sometimes we hate it. You know, it's sort of like that changes over time too. And I feel like we're probably ripe for another shift in the paradigm as we think about like, well, do we love or do we hate popular culture now in 2020?
It made me think of the responsibility of institutions.
All right, there's one vote. Davina loves it.
What'd you say, Davina? I'm sorry, I talked to you.
She said, so do we love it? Popular culture in 2020? She says, we love it.
We love it. I mean,
Yeah.
we discuss, I mean, popular culture is like this water cooler moment with friends or with teachers, right? For instance, when I go for these long meetings with my supervisor, my PhD supervisor, we end up discussing some new television series or some new book or something or even memes for that matter. I mean, if you're talking about popular culture, memes are also part of it, right?
All right, let's everybody else weigh in on it. Love it or hate it, popular culture right now in 2020.
That's the wrong question.
Why does it have to be a binary?
Yeah. I think Renee, she's trying to frame us. So with the
I was an English
question.
major, right? Renee, you were an English major. I was an English major. I read Steinbeck as an English major, but some people read Steinbeck because they liked it.
Right.
And they just entertained.
Right.
And so those people still exist in this form, you know, in this context.
Right.
I've been, you know, part of it is I think I've been thinking more about, because of a class that I'm doing, about it from kind of a folklore angle. And, you know, so it's not so much, you know, corporate top-down media distribution breaking off into fan communities. I mean, specifically, we were talking about urban legends and the development and distribution of folk knowledge, which is a very bottom-up process, but still has a lot of like, you know, it works in the digital environment too. And, you know, can, in some cases, I mean, I think the desire is kind of to resist the corporatization of it. And what I'm thinking specifically is of like the creepypasta community, which are people who basically share, you know, horror stories and things like that. And, you know, it's something that's been around forever and will be around forever. And yeah, there's horror movies and all of that, a lot of top-down culture, but there's also this bottom-up folk stuff that has an enormous amount of value, right?
Yeah, but there's also this bottom-up folk culture that has an awful lot of awful, right? I just finished reading another possible book for our book club, Antisocial by Andrew Marantz. He's the New Yorker critic who's been covering the alt-right. And he shows very powerfully how the alt-right and the racist, anti-Semitic discourses that are driving the movement were very much bottom-up, popular expressions, right? And through virality, those marginal, mainstream, awful, heinous ideas became popular. And so I feel like I'm more fearful about popular culture now that it has lost now that it's escaped from corporate control. because of the dark side, who have absolutely no scruples.
And yet when I was at Midwest PCA, there were a lot of presentations about fan cultures that were emphasizing the kind of predatory, masculinist toxicity that becomes part of the, kind of like, I know more than you do, therefore you don't count kind of thing.
So is it right to say that we might want to regulate the internet in the near future?
Okay, that's an interesting topic. Natasha, should we regulate the internet in the future? Why or why not?
Yeah, okay, I've got an answer for you. I don't know. I think
should Natasha regulate the internet? I think
yeah, I'll give me a title, czar, and I'll do it. No, I think the key, you won't be surprised to hear this, but I think the key is to help people understand how the internet works. Like, I think that, for me, unlocks a lot of stuff, because I think people don't understand how the internet, I don't fully understand how the internet works. But I think, beyond filter bubbles and, beyond, that's only the tip of the iceberg. I saw on Twitter the other day, Doug Belshaw had a piece about this, where he had a literal iceberg, and on the top was fake news, and underneath it were, the things that are hidden, all the sort of algorithmic pieces of the puzzle, and corporate influences. And I think that's, if we unpack that a little bit, and I think that's true of every technology, hasn't there? Like, when TVs were in living rooms, right? People needed, and by people, I mean all of us. I'm not, suggesting a divide here, but I think, what role does it play? Just stopping and pausing and thinking about, what role does this new technology play? And then how does it function? And I think those are really important questions before we can get to regulating. And I think there are some things that have to be done. When you look at the basic steps that have been taken in Europe, just in terms of opting in or opting out, what's included in the terms and conditions, all of that stuff. I think that is basic and should be included everywhere. But beyond that, I would have no idea how you'd go about starting that.
If we had a functional, I agree with Natasha on let's use the German GDPR as a great starting point that should happen in the United States. But then if we had a functioning Congress, I would say, let's repeal the CDA 230 that lets platform companies off the hook when they distribute false, defamatory, dangerous, that industry is being protected by that rule in ways that are really bad for the public. But the problem is, with this Congress, they might replace that law with something even worse, right?
And how do you
trust Congress to fix the problem right now, right? But
how do you define, how do you define what's dangerous? Who gets to, come up with the definition for that term? That's so squishy,
Well, if the CDA were repealed, then then everybody would rely on the First Amendment, which is that anything can be published, but there can be punishment for defamatory, false, dangerous, inciting. The First Amendment would still apply, and then that would allow judges to make those determinations. But right now, that doesn't even happen because the CDA protects the industry so much. But yeah.
I feel, for whatever it's worth, I would imagine a lot of you share this. During the Obama administration, I was very disappointed as a public education advocate that there wasn't a better conversation about the purpose of the public that would interfere with the fact that anything that, basically moneyed interests don't want is accused of being socialism. so that the conversation about the relationship between the public and private didn't really move. And Arnie Duncan made it worse, and a lot of their environmentally there was a little bit more that kind of went in some good directions, but in terms of communication policy, because of that lack of a conversation, it pretty much set up where we are now, where it's been just overtaken by private interests. So
it's a great point. Yeah, Obama's biggest failing, education policy. Yeah, for sure, really true.
Just to lighten the mood a little, you know.
Well, so to change the topic a little bit off of regulation, I am intrigued at what is the future of transmedia storytelling. It is an idea that's developed beautifully in this book, and it represents a potential rich field of creativity. To what extent are you participating in, or to what extent does transmedia storytelling in its 2020 version affect your life? Is this an idea that still resonates with you?
So what I'm doing in my PhD thesis is I'm looking at how young people live online. What do they do, with their social media? And more often than not, they create a lot of media. So in forms of posts, whether it's Instagram posts or Instagram stories, and then taking that and sharing it elsewhere. So you'll have that being shared with WhatsApp groups. That could also become a Facebook status message. So I'm not so sure how far it becomes a participatory culture thing, but it certainly is used for self-expression and meaning making and identity and presentation of the self, basically. So, yeah.
It's true.
I'm sorry, I missed the beginning of the conversation. Did you talk about spreadable media at all? Has that come up?
No, we didn't talk about it at all. That's his other book. Talk about it. That's his other book.
Yeah, there were a couple of co-authors. There used to be a really good video MIT did online of an interview with the three of the authors, but for some reason MIT's video stuff disappeared off of their online. But the idea that there were these communities, and that one of the authors focused specifically on the Christian music community, and the way it was sort of like off the standard economic grid. It was kind of outside of that, but it was kind of like an old troubadour model, but it was kind of in the digital realm, and kind of built up over time, and then eventually became a larger and larger presence in commercial radio. Unfortunately, as commercial radio was becoming less and less valuable. But the idea that and I'm not sure if this was a cultural notion or an economic notion, that he was arguing that, that things need to have a characteristic of spreadability in order to have cultural value. And whatever spreadability was supposed to be, it was the opposite of stickiness. I kind of wish the terms spreadable and sticky were different, because they just involve too many other bad metaphors. But the idea that, it was all, an on-demand culture that would, distribute itself pretty much. And again, like you were pointing out earlier, Renee, this kind of idea that, and of course, all that's going to be good. People aren't going to spread misinformation. People aren't going to spread nonsense and deep fakes and stuff that just kind of muddies the environment. So I think it was some really good ideas in it that he was arguing for. But again, that sort of like corrective that people could use this for reproducing really awful stuff, even inside of the Christian community, where you see a lot of reproduction of homophobia and that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's a great observation. I mean, he was talking about spreadability and virality years before Kony 2012, before we really understood virality as a phenomenon. So very early on, he understood this, the benefits of sharing. We are now understanding the harms of sharing. So again, that pendulum swing thing. But yeah, it's true. And I agree. The phrase, I don't even use spreadable or sticky. I just say virality, right? Because But even that word is a problem word. So every word is a problem word.
Yeah, because he also points out that if it has a negative connotation like piracy or Lessons talked about that a lot too.
Disease.
I always ask my students to hold up their hands if they're felons, you know, just to see how many of them will actually admit to downloading stuff. But the other thing, and this was again something Midwest PCA, somebody did a presentation about the TV show Rizzoli and Isles. I don't know if you're familiar with that. It was, I think the polite term would be queer baiting, because it was about, I think it was a cop and a forensic expert. They were friends. And it was like the show was just trying to work to try to put them in what would potentially be, you know, sort of like the appearance of a gay relationship when it actually, but they were never confirming it. And so they had a really big gay community following for the TV show that eventually got frustrated with the baiting part and went off on its own, and then did its own construction of, you know, sort of like realizing what they wish they would see in the show, and kind of stopped watching it. So the viewership numbers went down, and then the show went off the air. But it was really interesting to think about, you know, kind of that whole, the way that evolved.
See, that's back to Henry Jenkins again, though, isn't it? That's like textual poachers again. Sorry, Davina, go ahead.
Yeah, no. So quite like the BBC Sherlock fandom frenzy about putting Sherlock and Watson together.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, what's the popular show? It's, Supernatural plays that too. It's in its 15th season. You know, it's one of the most popular shows on television.
So you were talking about piracy, and the first thing that I thought of was this producer director in India, and he was doing this podcast with a famous YouTuber group in India, and he said that I love piracy. And I was a little confused because usually media content producers or directors don't say that. He said, I want my work to get out there. I don't care how people access it, and I don't care much for studios and the economics of it. But as long as my artistic expression reaches as many people as possible, I actually like piracy. So that's a very interesting take, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of authors feel that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what one person's piracy is one person's open access, right?
Yeah.
When I started publishing music, and that was when the revolution was happening in music with independent, you know, when digital music had created a movement among independent artists, there were a lot of people that were putting their own stuff on Napster because they wanted people to hear it. And Dave Matthews was a big player in that. You know, Dave Matthews Band, where they were putting stuff on Napster that their producer wouldn't let them bring into the studio because they wanted it to get popular so that they could record it. Just interesting dynamic there.
Right. Well, the best book on that topic is by Yochai Benkler. It's called The Wealth of Networks. And it basically says that if we eliminated copyright law, basically there would be no financial incentive to keep things protected, and authors could do what authors want to do, which is have their stuff circulate freely in culture. And he says that would lead to an explosion of creative expression that would accelerate the economy. He says everybody thinks that if we got rid of copyright, the economy would fall apart, but maybe when he looks at it, he's an economist, maybe it would accelerate economic development instead of shut everything up in silos like it is right now. It's a crazy idea, but.
No, but if you just flip that, 50 Shades of Grey was supposed to be this fan fiction, like a collaborative work, right? I think it was off of Twilight, is that right? Right. And then they took that and then they wrote about it, and James sort of took over, and now she's commodified it. It's her book,
right? Her
series, rather.
Right. Yeah.
Well, I mean, historically, copyright is much not as old as creation. So for, you know, like what Frank was saying, nobody really owned music for most of its history. It was transferred and people copied it and continued to spread it. And you could acknowledge people who were, you know, quality people, but it wasn't necessarily that anybody owned it. It was the distribution that kind of reified it. So.
Oh, folk music, for that matter.
Since we're coming to the end of our time, you guys are talking about copyright, and that's creating a perfect entree to the next event that's coming up at the Media Education Lab. So if you take a look at our upcoming events, the next webinar is on Tuesday, February 11th, and it's called The Road to Copyright Clarity. And so this is a project that is co-sponsored by the Northeast Ohio Regional Library System and the Media Education Lab. It's a 1-hour webinar. You're welcome to join us. We're basically, we're gonna try to answer all your questions about copyright and fair use by understanding the different kinds of misinformation about copyright that's interfering with good practice in schools and libraries, understand the purpose of copyright law, and understand the power of inquiry and creative practices around remix as they support, that they are supported by the doctrine of fair use. So, so before our March book club meeting is a event in February, you're all welcome to.
Okay.
So does it make sense for people?
No, that's perfect. That's perfect.
Does it make sense for people outside of USA to join in, or?
Well, copyright is unique to the American copyright law is not Indian copyright law. So if you want to learn more about American copyright law, but it's not French copyright law, which is actually got some very cool nuances to it.
Yeah, so. But it's nice maybe to see the comparison you see, and then I feel like in the liberal arts education system, then I try to make it so, and I might maybe gonna share it like also with my friends in the other American universities all around the world. So that's gonna be, so watch out for the participants. So I think then we're gonna come to an end, I guess, because it hits 4 o'clock. Well, it's 4 o'clock in my place, 10 o'clock maybe Renee's place, Frank, right? Ralph, what time is it in your place?
It's 2:30. No, it's 9 a.m.
Oh, you're a liar. I'm gonna have to end the meeting, otherwise they're gonna have it on record. So it's gotta be. But well, thanks so much everybody for joining.
Good to see you all.
I see you all like in March. I'm gonna send out an email with Sam, and yeah, so she was traveling, but she's saying hello, of course, to everybody. So thanks a lot. It was a great discussion. I learned a lot. I was a bit more quiet, but then. Okay, thanks.
You rock.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thanks.
you too, guys.
Thanks for
Have a nice
organizing.
one. Thank you. Bisous, bisous.
Appreciate it.